4, you mean?
Question 4.
Okay. Right. You okay? Big files there. Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome to the session this morning. As you know, we're doing a follow-up piece of work on our report and the government response on the closure of the FSS. We're looking forward to evidence from you this morning. For the record, I'd be grateful if you would introduce yourselves.
I'm Managing Director of NFL Forensics.
Martin Everson, the Professor and Director of Northumbria University Centre for Forensic Science.
I'm David Richardson, the Chief Executive LGC.
Thank you very much. Just starting off generally, were there any real opportunities created for the private providers with the closure of the FSS?
Well, the FSS obviously had a fairly large share of the market at the point that the closure was announced, so inevitably there was more work made available as a result of that closure. There was also the opportunity to acquire some of the intellectual property that the Forensic Science Service had developed, and clearly expertise as well, because they had some excellent scientists working for them.
Well, as a university centre, I'm not sure I'm really in a position to comment on that. My only observation would be that by the time a more open market emerged, the situation was such that I feel it was rather difficult for the private providers to compete effectively in a market that had really been damaged as a consequence of restructuring in the economic recession.
I felt that the closure of the FSS gave an opportunity for private companies to be able to procure forensic services which they were able to provide.
Okay. So who are now the real key players?
Well, I think LGC probably still is the largest player in the market now. But Orchid Cellmark, who you heard from at when you last looked into this, and Key Forensic Science, I think, would probably be the other two other biggest players, but there are a range of smaller players as well involved in the market.
So LGC have now got the largest share of the market.
We believe so, yes.
How much do you think you've got?
We think we've probably got just under 50%.
Is that a healthy situation, do you think, in terms of competition?
I think it's a temporary situation. Our market share has been higher than that over the past year and a half, and I think that was inevitable given the fairly rapid speed of the closure of the FSS. It was about the providers in the market stepping up to the plate and being able to maintain continuity in terms of the delivery of forensic science services. So it was about getting to the end of that process in good order. After that, as you may be aware, there have been a number of other tenders, and inevitably our market share has declined because of the structure of those tenders, where in most cases single providers were not able to win all the work. So we would see our market share probably continuing to come down a little bit and settling at a somewhat lower figure than 50%.
Does that conform to your thinking from the other two panellists?
I would tend to be in agreement that there is going to be some fluctuation in market share from the way that the tenders are actually structured. With some exceptions, there's not single provider allocated in each case for each lot. Therefore, they ensure, the police forces and consortia ensure that they have options to go to one or the other. And I would imagine that's to an extent control of disaster events and ensures a variety of productivity.
I mean, Professor Everson, looking at from the independent point of view of an academic, do you see there being a healthy market now, and do you think the leaving it to the market in the way that's occurring is going to produce a satisfactory outcome?
I struggle to see it as healthy, really. I think the gross decline in the overall market is bound to have a be challenging for the providers attempting to find or keep a foothold in the marketplace. And I'm also uncertain as to whether the contraction is continuing or whether it's come to an end. So I suppose I struggle to see it as a healthy environment, and I fear that there are still difficulties further along that will be encountered until some kind of stable situation is reached. I think the second part of your question concerned whether private provision was likely to be effective. Did I understand that correctly? My point of view is that the issue is not whether the provider is a public or private organisation. It's whether provision is effective both financially, because it has to be provided cost effectively, whoever's providing it, and whether it's provided in the interest of the criminal justice system. So it's to my mind, it's not a question of public versus private. It's just a question of how arrangements can be made so that forensic science service provision is done effectively by whoever it's done by.
Okay. Stephen.
Thank you, Jim. Morning. Just going back to the size of the market issue. When we were talking about this 18 months, 2 years ago, there was 150 odd million figure banded around, dropping to 120, I think. The Home Office now estimates that the market is around 80 to 90 million. Firstly, is that a figure that you recognise and would kind of agree is around the size of the market? And secondly, why do you think it has contracted so much quicker than perhaps the projections were 2 years ago?
I think to answer the second part of the question first, the speed of contraction is due to the austerity measures, I think, primarily, and the cost-saving pressures that police are being placed under, and therefore there's disincentive to outsource forensic services to the extent that they were, and insourcing, whether it be in laboratories or even in different manners, such as screening out items prior to even examining them, has greatly increased with prioritisation of forensic examinations. This has all contributed to a great contraction of the outsourced marketplace, and as such it makes it very difficult for a commercial organisation to actually predict what demand may be, and when one is provided with an estimate of what case numbers may be from a particular tender, in fact, when the reality can turn out to be a fraction of the prediction, it makes it incredibly difficult for business continuity.
And do you think then, you talked about insourcing. Bear in mind we were in the sort of the period of austerity 2 years, 18 months ago. Do you think this has happened quicker then than anyone had imagined?
I think the process has accelerated, yes, and I think there's quite a large amount of work that would otherwise have been outsourced to an FSP rather than at present now, where it's essentially controlled within police scene of crime.
Yes, I'd agree with all of that. I would say that in our view the market is probably slightly less than that. We think 70 to 80 million. But we also believe that process is not yet concluded. I mean, not least because there is continued pressure from the austerity measures and further cuts to come in policing budgets, but also because of initiatives such as streamlined forensic reporting, where the forensics that is done is only sufficient to get to the point where there might be a guilty plea. So we think that the process is likely to continue, and I would certainly agree that insourcing has been an important factor in the reduction of the available market as well.
Okay. Did you want to comment?
Yes, I just wanted to say that my colleague in our centre, Dr. Maguire, has tried to bring together some figures relating to market size, and I think his estimate comes out a little bit less than the Home Office estimate is about 70 million. I agree with my colleagues here that reluctance to outsource is reducing police expenditure. I also imagine that there may be some fear, given the restructuring of the forensic science providers, that's creating a kind of vicious circle where we prefer not to spend and we're a little bit worried about what's going on outside, if you like, so we'll not spend. I also perceive a more medium-term effect in that forensic science enjoyed years of profligacy, really. And I recall in the Forensic Science on Trial report that the McFarlane report is cited that refers to the entrenched monopoly of the Forensic Science Service, which enjoyed the gift of Alec Jeffrey's exciting discovery and several hundred millions of pounds of the taxpayers' money to do something with it. And I think in a way that created a very artificial world for forensic science to live in. And that world started to change, and then all of a sudden it came radically to an end. And I think there might be a sort of knock-on effect of a bigger picture as well that's manifesting itself now.
And are you alluding there to the market being sustainable in the medium to long term? That actually, if it continues to drop, there must be a point at which it impacts on profits of private providers, dramatically not knowing what the numbers will be, and therefore people actually physically pulling out of the market.
Well, I think if government wants a viable market, then it can have one. I think the question is what structure it decides to put in place to create that. At the moment, I think the customers are in a very strong position to drive down their expenditure, which is driving down the financial viability of the providers, and that's not a healthy situation. I suppose my preferred model would be one where the providers can be licensed to provide services and be able to do so at a cost which allows them to make a respectable, if modest, profit, and then the market is healthy. Issues like research and development can be dealt with, matters of regulation can be dealt with. But at the moment, the situation where the police services can act as customers, they can act as competitors, and in a sense, via the Home Office, they're also the arbiter. That just looks like a model for disaster to me.
Do you think the police actually, do you think it's all to do with economics, or are the police naturally reticent about outsourcing, and that actually there's a major issue here that it would be better use of police money if there was more outsourcing?
Well, I can understand. I'd be second guessing what the police think to a certain extent, but I can understand how they want to keep their costs down. That's perfectly reasonable. I think there's also a tendency, which is a little bit more of a sensitive issue, I think, for the police to try and keep everything within their mandate and remit and control. And in a sense, that's also partly understandable, but since forensic science exists to support the rule of law, that's not necessarily healthy because it brings with it certain risks of the independence of the criminal justice process in relation to forensic science.
Sorry, thank you for answering so fully my earlier question. Gentlemen, Mr. Richardson, Dr. Manlove, you're actually trying to operate in this shrinking, changing market. Do you see it becoming unsustainable at some point if the market continues to shrink as it has been?
I think it's quite difficult to say that it will become unsustainable. I think there are some challenging aspects of the market at the moment, and Professor Everson has touched on some of them. But what we've seen in forensic science over the past probably 10 years or so has been a series of peaks and then followed by, if not troughs, certainly periods of some stagnation in the market development. This may just be another one of those. Clearly the economic situation is not helping that. I would say, just in relation to the other matter, that the commercialisation of the parts of forensic science that have been commercialised has brought tremendous benefits, I think, in terms of improved turnaround times, reduced cost and so forth. Those benefits are clearly available to the police to access in relation to other aspects of forensic science that are currently not in the commercial domain. And so, for example, if that were done by police forces, you would see the market beginning to grow again, or the available market beginning to grow again. So I don't like the word unsustainable because I think it's actually, it implies crisis and potential disaster, and I certainly don't see either of those things on the horizon.
Thank you. Final question then. I mean, the government does have a role in all of this. Obviously, you touched on that. One of the criticisms at the time that the announcement was made about the closure of the FSS was that the government didn't have a strategic view on forensic sciences. Do you think a strategic view has now emerged about what its approach to both the market is and to forensic science generally?
A little unclear in perhaps what a strategy may be at present. There's been a vast number of changes in the market within the last couple of years, and I think, to be honest, everyone's possibly trying to come to terms with that, both the police and the commercial providers. I think as a commercial provider, and say Mr. Richardson is in exactly the same position, that we've risen to every challenge that's been asked of us. We've been asked to provide services which we have been in a position to be able to deliver as requested. I think there now needs to be perhaps a settling period, and I don't think we're quite at the point where there will be, and where we can actually regain a direction as to where forensic science is going, but you'll forgive me for not being exactly clear on what the present strategy may be.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean,
comment?
I don't think there is a clear strategy at the moment. I think some of the mechanisms for that exist, the Forensic Science Policy Group, for example, but so far that's had very little, if any, interaction with the suppliers, and they're clearly a very important part of the equation. It has been a very difficult period because of the speed that things had to be done. And so I'm not sure that I see much prospect of stability, because I do think there are still trends in the market. But what I think would be useful to do is if the various stakeholders, police, Home Office, academia, providers, were able to get around a table and just debate what kind of a market we would like to see evolving over the next few years, rather than, as I think at the moment, it's just being left to the outcome of the tender process. And that in itself is, clearly driven by a number of things, pricing and police desire to actually have the work done by outside providers. It's not being done, in my view, with an overview and a strategic direction at the moment.
And what about the issue of transparency? Is that, you said get those stakeholders round a table, that requires a transparent approach. You're saying that isn't being adopted either, that there's still some sort of clouding of the issue?
I think it is cloudy at the moment, but I think part of that, as Dr. Banlove has said, is because we've been through that transitional period, and it's been kind of one thing after another. I mean, we've had, in the last 3 or 4 months, we've had 3 tenders where about 45% of the market has potentially changed hands. That's a bigger transfer than the Forensic Science Service closed down, and it's gone, A, a lot faster, and B, almost unremarked. That is astonishingly disruptive to providers, I'm sure to forces as well. It's difficult for our scientists. I mean, that's the other thing. I think in all of this, we talk about these big pictures and companies gaining or losing market share. These are scientists. These are highly intelligent and motivated people who look to the future with a degree of uncertainty, and that, as the leader of one of those organisations, is a worry and a concern to me.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thank you, Chair.
Dave.
Thank you, Chair. Aside from the Metropolitan Police taking over the FSS Lambeth Lab, has there been more police insourcing of forensic work?
I think as a general comment, I would have to say yes. I think some of that has been around specific areas of forensic science. We see, for example, I think more firearms work going in-house, and some other areas as well. There has been more work done in police submission units, and I think I touched on this when I was last before you, where the idea of increasingly the commercial providers being sent material to analyse rather than being involved in the strategic overview of the case, which I see as a retrograde step. I think that has probably been happening more as well, with some important exceptions of forces who have chosen to go down a different route.
If a police lab is accredited to ISO 17025, is there still a risk of criminal justice?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I entirely understand the question.
The question is, if it's been accredited to a commercial basis, do you think that there's a risk there to criminal justice?
Well, I mean, I think accreditation provides a very important foundation for quality. It can't, of itself, ensure quality, but it's an important standard. And we have, for some time, suggested that the regulator should have statutory powers to enforce that, and that standard should be there as a level playing field for anybody submitting evidence to the criminal justice system. And that's possibly an area that you may want to think about further. It's important, though, for all the providers to have quality systems around and built on 17025,
yes.
Over and above the basic requirement, I think.
Thank you. Any other comments on that?
Absolutely second what's been said by Mr. Richardson. It is essential that the minimum standard is ISO 17025 for forensic science providers. There is a dichotomy in provision to the criminal justice system at present, whereas some of the police laboratories do hold the accreditation standard, some do not. And although most are striving towards that standard and developing their own quality systems and working within the same spirit of the system, whilst it is mandatory for a forensic science provider to hold ISO 17025 to be able to provide services to the criminal justice system, it is not mandatory at present for police laboratories in the same manner.
And from an academic point of view, again, independent of the people with commercial interests, has there been any evidence that this lack of accreditation or the insourcing has had an impact, a detrimental impact on criminal justice?
Presently, I'm not aware of any, but I think it needs to be asked whether the reason that the Forensic Science Service, for example, was established in the first place was to increase the distance from the investigation of the Forensic Science Service analytical process. And I think having the police service be the investigator and the scientist can lead to too close a relationship between the two processes. And even with the best will in the world, there's always a danger of confirmation bias, an honest and virtuous attempt to find the answer that's being looked for, which may not necessarily be the right answer. It's a term sometimes referred to as tunnel vision, and it can be an honest mistake. And so I think that, in principle, there should be separation from the police service investigative process and the forensic science analytical process, and maybe to an extent the scene of crime examination process.
Mind you,
they're just little protections.
Just seems to me the public might believe the exact opposite is the case if they followed some television series.
Yeah, probably.
Anyway, move on to Sarah.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to pick up on this whole issue of creating a level playing field between defence or the police and private companies who are providing forensic science to the criminal justice system, and looking particularly in the context of regulation, because we've heard that there is a very unequal, I think people would think quite alarming, lack of an equal playing field here, and the quality standards that could be adopted by different parts of it. So could you describe to me whether you feel that we've touched on it a little bit, whether the statutory powers should be given to the forensic science regulator?
Yes, I believe the forensic science regulator should have statutory powers, but not just to be able to regulate the quality of the marketplace as is widely perceived in terms of the forensic science providers and also the police laboratories. But there is one grey area at present that seems to fall through the gaps, and that's the defence scientists. Our company, a percentage of our work is review, where we are working on behalf of defence solicitors and barristers. And as such, we carry out our work in exactly the same way as we would carry out our work on behalf of police customers, where we receive a request, we analyse it, and we produce an unbiased, impartial report addressing the queries which have been asked. We have had to obtain the quality standard. We've jumped through many hoops and attained the high standard. Our scientists all perform in the manner that would be expected for working for the police if they're working for the defence as well. There's a number of issues that spring from this, not least that several of the defence scientists and companies do not have quality standards, or the quality standards they have are not necessarily of the same bar as 17025. Further, when one is working for the defence, often we are now doing original work because it's work that hasn't been done in the first place due to streamlined submissions. This is not necessarily subject to the same review by the prosecution as the prosecution work may be by the defence, and we believe this is also an area which ought to be highlighted.
That is very concerning, I'm sure. You've touched on the defence side, but so you very much believe in regulation. Are there any other examples you can give us where the lack of regulation has caused problems along the lines you've described? And this could be for any one of you to answer.
Can I very briefly answer?
Yeah, please.
There are, I don't want to go into specific details in this forum, but there are specific examples of where there are individuals practicing in areas in which they are not competent to practice. They are able to go into a court of law reviewing evidence of a competent scientist. Their evidence is not always accurate, not always correct, and may well distort the evidence to the court. When the jury has the choice between one individual and another, and they don't necessarily have the understanding of science to be able to choose between them, it can cause great problems for a case.
That's a very powerful case for regulation. Would anybody else like to comment?
I think the only thing that I might add to that is that inevitably, if it's an unlevel playing field, there comes a point at which you say, is the additional cost from being an accredited provider in this field really justified, because we're up against people who don't have to reach those standards? And sooner or later, you have to consider whether you want to continue to offer services in that arena. That can't be, I think, in the interests of the forensic science provision to the criminal justice system. And so levelling up of that playing field, I think, is an urgent requirement. There is, I believe, a deadline for police labs to be accredited by November of this year. I think that is still in place, although I know that stemmed from something that came out of the Treaty of Lisbon, so it's a slightly unclear position at the moment given our stance in relation to that. But I think there's a further question, which is exactly what is being accredited and what the scope of the accreditation, because you can't just say a force is accredited to do what and where are important questions as well.
Dr. Manlow made a strong statement there. He said he didn't want to sort of discuss it here. Is there any way that we can take it offline at all, Chairman? And because I'm concerned about what was said there, and if there's any way we can look at it.
Perhaps you could direct us some cases that give you concern.
Might I do that at a later date? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, back to you. Thank you, Steve.
I think we've heard, very powerful evidence for the need for regulation. Should that regulator be more independent from the Home Office?
My view would be yes. I think, as I suggested in my written submission, I'd like to see a licensing model where the provider is licensed to provide forensic services. The regulator's job is to make sure that their procedures and standards are up to scratch. If they don't, they lose their license, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Or there's a risk that they will. And that would be my preferred structure. I also would not like to see the licensing body be the Home Office. I'd like to see it to be an independent body, somewhat analogous to Ofwat or a similar body of that kind.
Dr. Manlow, would you like to comment on that as somebody who would have to participate in such a system?
I think in terms of licensing, the Forensic Science Society is at present taking measures to look at assessing individuals' accreditation, and indeed I know that that society has applied for chartered status. I think they're ideally placed to be conducting these assessments, and I think, given that, one thing I would stress, though, however, is given we do have a number of sole practitioners whose contribution to the CJS is very valuable, the costs of this should be thought very much to the fore, as if over-expensive such people may decide, albeit on a far smaller scale than one of the FSPs, to actually withdraw their services from the market. Whilst ISO 17025 has its place, giving us an excellent management structure for a firm and providing the areas of technical performance to which we may become accredited, I believe there should also be a level of accreditation for each scientist, a registration process of a type. But for an FSP to bear a significant cost in relation to each member of staff for a registration, in addition to the maintenance of 17025, unfortunately we do have to bear in mind the commercial pressures we're under, given the market we have. So as such, yes, while I'd be encouraging of such a measure, it would have to be cost effective. When we did have CRFP, that was one model that could be taken. I understand that it was heavily subsidised. I think the cost was in the order of £170 a year, I think it was, per scientist. I may have that figure wrong, so forgive me, but that was not mandatory at that time. And indeed, whilst I was expecting, having gone through that process, for members of the judiciary to be asking me about my registration status as time went by, in fact, it didn't seem to be a system that was widely bought into, and indeed was abolished a few years ago, as we know. I do think that there is somewhat of a vacuum at present, and we do need to have that filled. It may well answer a number of the issues that I just raised.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. Would anybody else like to comment on this issue of statutory regulation?
Can only say that I think we have found in our work with the regulator that he's taken a very independent and forceful stance on a number of things. We welcome that, and we think it's important that the regulator is robust in that regulation. I think that's what we've seen. I do recognise, though, that as a large provider, we may find it easier to work with that regime than other smaller providers.
Can you put it into perspective, Mr. Richardson, about your earlier comments about ISO 17025? It's a cost, it's a big cost. There's presumably a cost in getting to that standard and a cost in maintaining that standard. And I'm presuming that, given the scope of the work that you do, a wide range of services that you provide, the cost would be quite substantial to you.
Yes, it's very substantial.
Order of magnitude?
It's difficult for me to put a figure on it, because a lot of the people involved in the process of getting accreditation for a particular thing that we're doing will clearly have other jobs that they're doing at the same time. So difficult to say, well, 5% or 10% of somebody's role was about accreditation. But we acquired the intellectual property of a thing called DNA Insight from the FSS. We in fact got that accredited yesterday. Now, we've been on that process for a considerable number of months. I would say probably at least a year. There's been some development involved as well of the software. There is training and methods to be developed. You can tell from that will have involved a considerable number of people, and this is just one piece of new software that we're introducing to try and speed up the process. Multiply that across, I think we have 83 or certainly over 80 accredited methods now. The need to keep training up on all of that, and well, you can see it's a very significant cost.
Thank you. Graham.
Professor, you said that R&D could be dealt with. Is it being dealt with? How easy is it to get money for research into forensic science?
It's extremely difficult and has been for a long time.
So it isn't being dealt with?
No.
Right, sorry, do you want to... I cut you off. It was a very clear answer, but do you want to expand on that?
Yes. Well, traditionally the research councils have not funded forensic science very much. Occasionally they do, but their remit is to fund highly innovative basic science research, and unfortunately forensic science rarely meets the standards of the basic science peer review college that one applies to. My own frustration during the life of the Forensic Science Service was, as well as enjoying an entrenched monopoly in service provision, they also enjoyed an entrenched monopoly in Home Office funded research. So I found it very difficult to get my own research off the ground using funds from the United Kingdom. I managed to fund my research from US funding sources. I do believe that there were consequences, wider consequences for the criminal justice system, although this might be a consequence of my own frustration, but I worked on low template DNA analysis at that time, and I couldn't get any funds from the Home Office to promote that research. I was funded by a US funding body. And the Forensic Science Service eventually developed low copy number DNA analysis, and I would hear stories from police officers in Merseyside, for example, that the charge for low copy number DNA testing of a handgun was £15,000. I heard that one of the Yorkshire coroners, and I think maybe the Humberside coroner, was quoted a fee of approaching £500,000 for the identification of the remains of 2 individuals who were killed in a very violent air accident. And as a researcher, scraping pennies together to try and do the research, to find that Home Office policy prevented me from receiving Home Office money to do the research, and then to find that these seemingly vast sums of money were being charged to do the very tests I was aiming to develop myself, I found very frustrating. And the Omar bombing trial collapsed, and my heart sank, because again low copy number analysis featured centrally to that. And I felt that if the Home Office had fostered a wider dissemination and development of that forensic technique and many others, that these sorts of situations would be less likely to arise. Methods would be validated in a competitive and pluralistic academic environment. In science, if you've got a smart idea, you can guarantee somebody else has got one as well. They're trying to get there first, they're trying to publish first. If you published first, they're trying to repeat or falsify your findings, and that's how science progresses, as an engine of finding fact. An entrenched monopoly is an expensive and not particularly effective way of doing that, in my opinion.
So has either the closure of the FSA or the Home Office review, have either of those things helped sort of access to research funds, or has nothing?
No, I can't identify any way that they have. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's very early days. The research councils will still have their peer review colleges, that they are unlikely to have changed very much. Their views of forensic science are unlikely to have changed very much. They tend to be populated by established research council funded academics, very few of whom are likely to be interested in forensic science, so they're not likely to be allies of your proposal, if you see what I mean. The technology transfer process is the technology strategy board route looks promising, but again I think that was referred to in the Forensic Science on Trial report in 2004-05, that route should be pursued. There are a couple of issues that arise from that, I think. One is that the technology transfer partnership route usually requires an idea that's close to market, and I don't know how many institutions have suitable close to market research findings that are suitable, and also I don't know which of the private providers now can offer some supportive match funding, which is also often required to fund these sorts of projects. So no, I can't see any evidence.
Just a final question. I was intrigued in your answer to Stephen Metcalfe when you said that forensic science had been through a period of profligacy.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that?
Well, Yes, I suppose my perception is that, repeating myself a little bit, that Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys made one of the most exciting scientific discoveries of the 20th century, and that was gifted to the Forensic Science Service along with several hundreds of millions of pounds of the taxpayers' money for DNA rollout. And the Forensic Science Service, after some little glitches, understandable glitches, made a very good job of it, but one might argue that under those circumstances it would have been a little bit inexcusable if they hadn't done so. I felt that, as I've already said, that they had rather a proprietorial attitude both to the market as discussed but also to research and development. They enjoyed preferred supplier status in the early days of the emergence of a competitive marketplace. And I kind of wonder what more could have been done to help them on the way to survival in a relatively free market. And I feel it's a question of cultural ethos as to why the Forensic Science Service was unable to adjust in those circumstances. And part of the reason why is that, in a way, they had it a little bit too easy. That they were protected, they had a monopoly that was funded by the taxpayer, and they couldn't change. Well, my perception is, my opinion is, my feeling is, they couldn't change their ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Richardson, I understand that there was quite a considerable number of SS staff went to LGC. Could you tell me how many of those transferred under 2P regulations?
I don't believe that many of them transferred. We employed about 148, 149 ex-FSS people.
Yes.
But I don't believe that very many of them came under 2P at all.
Did any?
I'm not aware that they did, no.
Okay, why was that the case?
There were a number of different circumstances involved. The most significant transfer came with the closure by the FSS of the Wetherby facility in the north of England. At that time, it was decided that facility was going to close, and we made an offer to open a new facility, in fact in scientific support unit of one of the North East forces, and at Wakefield. The staff who were in the Wetherby lab were offered a choice of routes. They could either take 2P, they could take redundancy if 2P wasn't relevant to them, or they didn't wish to take it, or we had a voluntary transfer whereby they could come across, and in return for a payment which had in its mirror a change in some terms and conditions, they could come to the new laboratory. We took just over 20 of those staff on that voluntary transfer scheme, and then we recruited a further, I think 27 or so of people who had taken the redundancy payment, but then came to us on the open market. We were advertising on the open market and came to us through that route.
Okay. We took evidence from prospects last week, and I'll read out the quote from Ms. Kenny, who gave us evidence. She said that through a combination of effectively scaring people, LGC encouraged people not to exercise their 2P rights. Is that something that you recognise?
That's nonsense.
Okay. Well, why did people choose not to take to transfer?
Because
I know you have explained that, but I'm not clear.
People had different circumstances, I'm sure. There were some, for example, who might have felt that the journey to Wakefield was too far for them, and therefore that for them personally redundancy was a better way to go. There may be some who felt that they were prepared to take their chance on the open market. There were others for whom the voluntary transfer made sense because the terms and conditions, which were of course driven by the needs of the force, we didn't just sort of pluck them from thin air. It was our customers who required a particular sort of service, and particular availability, and therefore some terms and conditions did need to change. And they made a choice that for them that would work and that would be okay. And so I think that is what was behind the fact that not everybody went down the same route. Okay,
thank you. Of the 148 who have transferred, how many are still with LGC?
All of the ones who transferred over at Wakefield are still there, to my knowledge. I mean, there may be ones and twos. I would say that probably the vast majority of the others are still there, but I think it's right to say at this point that we have recently announced we are going to make some redundancies driven by a tender that result of which was announced a month or two ago. And it's inevitable that some people who will have transferred to us from the FSS will be now part of the consultation process that we're in the middle of with our staff around those redundancies. And so some of them may well leave as a result of that process.
Okay. Are you able to tell us today how many that will affect?
I can't, because we're in the consultation process, so clearly until that's concluded it won't be clear how many are involved.
Okay. So of those staff who have transferred, how many of them are they in similar positions to what they would have been in FSS? Is their expertise and skills being used with LGC?
Broadly speaking, I would say that there are. I mean, it's difficult with those kind of numbers to be absolutely clear that everybody is doing exactly the same job. Indeed, I can probably be clear that they are not. There are bound to have been some changes. But broadly, it's not in our interests to pay for skills that we don't use, and it's not in our interest to recruit people who have got skills at a much higher level than we would use, because those people inevitably get bored and unhappy. So broadly speaking, I think they will be doing similar kinds of jobs to the ones that they were doing previously.
Okay, can I ask Professor Everson and Dr. Manlove, do you think since the closure of SSS, have you seen evidence that there has been a considerable number of skills went out the workplace? Obviously people have left, and those who have stayed in forensic science, are those skills still being utilised?
I'd say certainly with direct experience of recruiting individuals from some of the laboratories, I'm aware that certainly from the Forensic Science Service Chepstow laboratory, I believe in the order of 80% of the staff are no longer practicing in forensic science within an FSP. I think with the other laboratories the percentages may differ slightly. However, there's been a vast exodus from the marketplace of individuals who feel either it's unpredictable, it's no longer the job for a life that it was, it doesn't offer the security, or quite simply domestic reasons. They have their children in school, their partners have jobs in situ, and therefore they can't necessarily move. There's a variety of reasons as to why it's happened, and one may expect there to be attrition of staff if there is a considerable geographical relocation required.
I can tell you that some forensic scientists have gone into academia, probably a very small proportion though. My own institution in the last 2 years has recruited two former forensic science service, three former forensic science service scientists and one former LGC scientist. And although their opportunity to practice is likely to be very, very much diminished, the good thing about it is that they will be able to pass on their knowledge and experience to another generation. And my feeling is that this is a problem that's going to take a long time to resolve itself, and that is probably one of the good things that can be done.
Okay. Could I just add, if I may, Ms. Nash, that I think with the reduction in size of the market from, let's say, 150 to 180 million to under 80 million, it was inevitable that a large number of forensic scientists were not going to have employment in the industry anymore, because the industry is smaller than it was. So I think whether the FSS had stayed around or not, there would be many fewer forensic scientists working today than they were working 2 or 3 years ago. I think that's just the market, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much.
I just want to push you a bit further on your response to Pamela Nash on the conflict between your evidence and that of Prospect. The word nonsense may be your answer, but it's not an explanation. There is a clear conflict of interest, conflict of evidence between yourselves and Prospect. And given that I've had some years of experience going back to when Mrs. Thatcher brought in the 2P regulations in my previous incarnation, it just seems to me it's pretty unlikely that professional people who value things like the benefits of continuity of service that come with 2P would not choose to move to a new employer with 2P, but go on a voluntary arrangement that's out with 2P. I mean, it doesn't seem logical.
Well, I think that the comment that, as I understand it, was made by Prospect was that we had scared and frightened people. That is, in my view, nonsense.
Well, okay, that's nonsense, you say. But what is the explanation? It's not a logical position for somebody to choose to not take 2P when they are moving to the new employer. I agree there are people who would choose for the domestic reasons that Dr. Manlove said, may not wish to move to the new employer, but the ones that do, it is illogical for them not to exercise their 2P rights.
Well, it's difficult because you're asking me to get into the minds of people. I mean, as long as there was a free choice available to them...
These are your employees. You must know about their views.
Well, I don't know about the views of the 200 people who worked in the Weatherby lab, which is the group you're talking about, because they were not my employees. Some of them are now my employees. So all I can do, I think, is say what our experience was. We put in front of those people a choice, which was to come to us on a voluntary transfer with some changes in terms and conditions which met the needs that we had in serving our customer. They were entirely free, if they wished to come across on 2P or to take redundancy. They made the choices that they made. Speculating about why they made those choices, given that you were dealing with 200 people, is quite difficult for me to do. The ones who came to us, I can talk about. We do a staff survey of feedback for us every 2 years. We did one last summer. The results that came out of the Wakefield laboratory, our staff there, many of whom, as I've suggested to you, were ex-FSS, were among the very best, not only in the UK, but in our worldwide organisation. So the people who came across were clearly, broadly, as measured by that survey, content. The ones who didn't come, it's difficult for me to comment on.
I actually was asking you about the ones that did come, that didn't exercise 2P rights, but came on a voluntary new set of terms and conditions. I'm not disputing the people that left.
No, and I'm saying that the feedback we have had from those staff is that they are content with the situation that they have at the Wakefield laboratory. Why they chose to go down the route that they did, broadly speaking, about half of them came on voluntary transfer, and about half of them had taken redundancy, and we then recruited them on the open market.
Okay. Hal.
Thank you. Can I ask Mr. Richardson and Dr. Manlove, what's your archiving arrangements for your forensic material?
Our archiving arrangements? We follow the ACPO guidelines.
As do we.
Yeah. So you hold your own archives that are located with you. You know, the references are already being made to television programmes. You know, the popular image is that the police officer in the field phones the scientist somewhere who then peers into the screen, and you know, the parking offence in John O'Groats is linked to the murder in Land's End. We know that it has never been like that, of course. But, I mean, the question I want to ask you is, would it be a good idea to hold all materials in a central archive so that that source of reference could be at least facilitated, if not magically produced as on television?
Sure, Mr. Richardson would be in agreement that if we didn't have to hold the vast amounts of paperwork and retained materials that we did, that it would be something that we would look on very positively. As still being a case-working scientist, however, I do believe that we should keep the most recent material for court attendance and shortly afterwards, but I think it would be a very positive step if we only had to keep material for a measured amount of time after the conclusion of a case, and then it could be moved to a central archive.
I should say that some members of the committee did visit the Forensic Archive in Birmingham a little time ago, I mean, what all of you, I suppose, what do you think should be the future of Forensic Archives Limited?
I think maybe given that the cases, strictly speaking, do belong to the customers, although the physical paperwork is ours, it may be an idea, given also the potential instability of the market, that these are looked after in a central facility. There is the possibility that any one of us may have to withdraw from the market at one point, and then the question remains, in potentially short order, what happens to the archiving. I think there does need to be a well thought out strategy.
Yes, I mean, all of the evidence at the end of the day does belong to the police, and I would be entirely in agreement that, you know, if it was stored somewhere, that would probably be with assistance from our perspective. I think one thing I would say is that it would be important that the indexing of that material was carried out in a way that would enable its easy retrieval. And that is something of a challenge with the Forensic Archive, as I know you heard last week.
So yeah, I'm very much in favour of a central archive where the evidence can be kept securely curated so that it doesn't get damaged or lost.
Can I ask you just two brief follow-up questions? Are you aware that any such strategy is either existing or is being worked on by anybody from Home Office, for example? And also, given that you are private organisations, who should pay?
Sorry. I'm not aware that there is any strategy being worked on around this at the moment.
Nor am I.
You're referring to the archive?
Yeah, who should pay for the archive?
I struggle to see much evidence of strategy in Home Office forensic science policy at all, I'm afraid.
Okay.
David.
Thank you, Chair. How does the new forensic procurement framework compare to its predecessor? Are improvements needed, do you think?
I would say that the new framework has some improvements, but there have been a lot of challenges with it as well. And I think the first and most obvious one is that because we're in the transitional period, we are now operating at least 5, and you might argue many more than that, different protocols. So the first question that any of our scientists must ask is, which of the various protocols are we working on with this particular piece of evidence? Second thing is that there's been a tremendous proliferation of pricing points. We've some cases where particular tests that we're doing, we previously had 4 or 5 pricing points. There are now as many as 25 or 30. The administrative burden of working out exactly what it is we're doing and what we should be charging is clearly more significant than it was in the past.
I was slightly disturbed by what Professor Evanson said earlier on about an important case where 2 people were involved, where he felt that because of the costs that the correct evidence wasn't presented to the court.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was quite what I meant to say.
Well, could you elaborate? I mean, I thought that was very crucial, piece of evidence, because if we've got a situation where the police, expensive prosecutions are failing because the forensic evidence that's produced in the court is inadequate, then there is a fundamental problem, I'd put it to you.
Yeah, sorry, the case I was referring to was from some years ago, and it was a coronial inquiry, not a criminal justice system inquiry.
Right.
And I'm not quite sure what the outcome was. I'm only aware of the fact that a very large sum of money was quoted for doing an identification, which I imagine would have taken up most, if not all, of the coroner's annual budget. But
okay. But I conceive from what Mr. Richardson's saying that you're in a transition phase. You've got these 5 different protocols, differentiation in pricing points. But isn't there also a conflict in philosophy here? Because LGC Logistics stated that the introduction of the national framework has given forces a number of advantages, including lower pricing for outsourced work, greater control over spending. It's also had the effect of commoditizing forensic science and creating a transactional customer-supplier relationship, which was something that came up earlier on, separation of powers. Yet it goes on to say, we've created a transactional customer-supplier relationship rather than a partnership approach for crime solving. The desire for a partnership approach was echoed by witnesses at the session on 30th of January, which sadly I wasn't able to be here. But isn't there a conflict here? Because, I mean, either we want cosy old relationship of partnership, or we want a much clearer system where we have a transactional supplier relationship, and it seems to me there is actually resistance to change.
No, I wouldn't agree with that, and I don't think I'd agree with the fact that partnership relationships have to be cosy, which I take to be a pejorative term from your perspective. What we're talking about there is the fact that there was a situation for a period of time where forensic service providers would work alongside the police in determining the strategy that would be applied in any particular case. That relationship has changed as a result of the introduction of the new protocols, and as we've said there have been some very positive things coming from that. But it has meant that we've increasingly been asked to do particular tests which our forensic scientists may not be able to see the full context of. And an example I've used in the past is that previously we might have sent, let's say, been sent a jacket, and somebody would say, see what you can do with it. Now we'll be sent a snip from the jacket with a blood stain on it and saying, tell me what blood that is, give me a DNA profile. Those are two very fundamentally different tasks from a scientific point of view, because context is clearly extremely important. And because we are now just being asked to do a test, it is clearer, and the charging for it is easier in one sense. But the evidence that you might be able to get from that is perhaps less good.
Right. That's not only your agencies that are going through dramatic change. There's dramatic change in the policing. When you talk to the police, who exactly are you talking to now? What impact has the Police and Crime Commissioner elections had, please?
From our perspective, I think it's far too early to say. I mean, they've only been in post since the end of last year, so we're not seeing any direct impact of that at this stage.
Going back to the difference between transactional customer-supplier relationships and the partnership approach, isn't it likely that these police and crime commissioners, who are probably much more cost-conscious and may come from totally different backgrounds in industry, are going to be much more rigorous in their approach, and that is, it's more likely that they'll be favouring the approach where you do have a transactional customer-supplier relationship.
But the advantage of the partnership relationship, as we see it, is that you can look at the whole crime scene to court process, and that the adoption of a strategy that is more effective may also be cheaper. For example, it may be more likely to get to a guilty plea and save court time, as one example. So I don't think you can say that the adoption of a more challenging way of looking at costing is necessarily going to result in a low total cost, because you have to look at the full process, in my view.
Okay, fine. I've got one final question by your leave, Chair. Is fragmentation of casework occurring under the new framework?
I would say increasingly, yes, it is. It's not always necessarily detrimental to a case that different providers do different parts of a case. However, when there's potentially a major inquiry that is best dealt with, when there's total provision of service, potentially it's best to hold that under one roof. A particular example, I think, in relation to your question, is where there's DNA analysis done by one company, and the interpretation and subsequent interpretation and statement produced on that, and the interpretation of, say, for example, blood and a bloodstain pattern done by another laboratory, or be it police or forensic science provider. The value of a single scientist being able to interpret the meaning of the DNA results in relation to, say, that item of clothing is then to an extent lost, and there's not always going to be the bridge of communication that's maintained. It does create a danger of a slightly disjointed approach to a particular case, opening up potential avenues of defence that may not have been available previously, and certainly providing a risk that you move from what we call a level 2 stage, where you could potentially discuss activity in relation to individuals and DNA results, down to a level 1, just simply a source attribution of a particular result.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. That's been extremely helpful.
Is it possible, Mr. Chairman, that I just say one additional thing regarding the Forensic Science Service? Having worked within the Forensic Science Service for a number of years, and with their scientists at the end of the 90s and beginning of the following decade, I did not feel that the Forensic Science Service had a profligate attitude towards their work. I felt that they strived extremely hard to work in an efficient and effective way, and the managers of those teams also worked very hard to deliver in partnership with the police customer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. We'll go straight on to our second panel, if we may. So. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
You've been sitting in the back listening to the previous session, but for the record, it'd be helpful if you could introduce yourselves there.
Gary Pugh, Director of Forensic Services in the Metropolitan Police. To be fair to the other witnesses, I'm also a visiting Professor of Forensic Science at Northumbria University. Actually, in relation to the earlier session, I was also a Director in the FSS, and I was on the DNA Expansion Programme Board in terms of the expenditure of that money, so that may be relevant to your questions.
Chris Sims, I'm Chief Constable of West Midlands Police. I lead for ACPO on Forensic Science. I was also on the DNA Expansion Board some time back as well.
Good morning, I'm Kevin Morton. I'm the Director of Forensic Scientific Support Services, Regional Director for the Yorkshire and a Senior Practitioner, I would say.
Thank you for coming this morning, gentlemen. Could you start off by briefly explaining your involvement in the FSS transition?
Yeah, perhaps I'll kick off. This was a decision taken, I think, on largely economic grounds by Home Office. We, as ACPO, were consulted during the decision-making process, and then, of course, were a major part of the way in which the transition was handled. And Operation Slingshot was our operational name, which at its heart was managing the transition, making sure that the workload moved across smoothly, that criminal justice end users were served properly, and that, in effect, the new forensic market was able to kick in and take up the slack left by the FSS departure.
In terms of the Metropolitan Police, we considered very carefully the decision taken by the Home Secretary. We had some existing forensic science capability, which I can perhaps expand on later, and we decided, with the primary objective of maintaining service continuity, that we would expand our current forensic science capability to take on the recovery, interpretation, reporting of forensic evidence based at the Lambeth site, which was occupied by the FSS, but the site is owned by the Metropolitan Police. And we cheaply transferred around 100 staff over to the Metropolitan Police, and we set up that model, and that is now how we're delivering forensic science. We contract out the DNA profiling and the analytical services like toxicology and gunshot residue analysis.
I assisted with the ACPO 2 North East region transition in relation to the closure of the FSS. We were in a different position, I think, from the rest of the country, in that we had a relationship with the Forensic Science Service, long-standing relationship with the Forensic Science Service at Wetherby, which at the time was the only laboratory in the northeast of England. We wanted to continue that relationship and work in with them, and so we took a different view. Rather than go with the slingshot, we progressed a different route towards securing forensic services, but again, the main objective being to ensure continuity of service to the criminal justice system.
Mr. Sims, in the ACPO evidence, you state that it was difficult to identify savings achieved by the transition. Now, I'll preface my question by saying we had extreme difficulty in unravelling the cost base of the way police managed forensic science when we did our first report, and it was followed by one of our parliamentary colleagues did a series of FOIs, which I think is not a very satisfactory way of getting information from a public body, but that was what happened. And the consequence of that was some information that was, from an accountancy point of view, unintelligible. We had one large police force that said it couldn't separate revenue from capital, which rather surprised the minister when we put that to him. We had another large police force that I know rather well that got its decimal point in the wrong place, and some of the information was really not easy to understand. Now, we want to drill down into this issue of the transition and the current costs. Can you assist us in doing this? Because, I mean, for example, Mr. Williams mentioned a visit to Birmingham to look at the archive. I am presuming that a number of forces who have now decided to maintain their own archive have spent capital in establishing an archive. You know, some very expensive refrigeration equipment in Birmingham, for example. Is it going to be possible to get hold of proper costings of what each police force has spent on the transition, both in revenue and capital?
Well, the first probably thing to say is that the sort of behind that question feels the point that the transition was designed as a cost reduction measure, and it wasn't. I mean, the transition was brought about because of business failures within the FSS, and forces and government to an extent reacted to that to set up a new service.
Let me just stop you there. We're not making that presumption. If anything, what was lying behind our theory was that the dispersal of responsibilities would increase costs particularly on capital. We, at the moment, we have very little evidence to support that one way or the other.
Okay. Well, let's look at the pieces that we know, so that we definitely know that the external spend of forces has continued to fall from a point where it was around 180 million a year down to a point where it's now pushing towards 70 million a year. Now, some of that, a small part of that, is because forces like Gary's, the Met, has taken part of the service provision and is delivering itself. But I know from my experience in other forces, all of those decisions were based on business cases that they offered better value for money. So I think we can start with a very, very strong assumption that less money is being spent on forensic science than it was prior to the transition starting. Now, I'm very happy to help drill down, and probably the best way of drilling down, and I'm not sure that I can help you with the detail today, but looking at some of those business cases that were made and how the numbers, capital, revenue, everything stacks up behind them is probably the best way of understanding the overall picture from a sort of micro position. Gary, you want to?
Yes, I mean, in terms of my own experience, the governance that I went through in order to implement the changes we'd made, with that priority of maintaining service continuity, went to the Metropolitan Police Authority, and they approved a full business case. In fact, the full authority sat to hear this and consider this case in July of 2011. So for us, there wasn't a great deal of capital investment because we were effectively taking back the Lambeth site, which is owned by the Metropolitan Police. There was some limited capital expenditure in terms of equipment, but that was quite small, measured in the hundreds of thousands rather than millions. So there was limited capital outlay for us in that sense. I would also add, in relation to the archive, I mean, we have a very extensive archive of criminal cases and of forensic work that's undertaken. the Metropolitan Police indeed has a legacy of the National Fingerprint Service. So we are holding millions of fingerprint records.
The Met is in a slightly different position to the rest of the country in that respect.
Yes. The point I'm making is that archiving and managing, if you like, forensic material and records in criminal cases is core business for us and always has been. So we have the facilities to do that. In terms of storage of samples and fridges and so on, then we also have those as well because we...
Yes, but as I said, the Met is not the rest of the country.
Okay.
Yes.
But I think we're all in different positions. I mean, we all do elements of our own work around fingerprinting, and so we all do have some storage. The archive issue that I'm sure we'll want to talk in more detail about, it's become an issue because of the archive that the FSS held.
Yes, indeed.
And how that then is handled into the future.
Yes, indeed, absolutely. We'll come on to that later, if we may. So, from the FSS closure wasn't the driver in reduction of costs. The driver was a reduction in demand. Is that essentially the
driver to reduce costs?
No, I mean, there has been a reduction in demand for forensic science work.
Well, there's been a series of things. There's been a reduction in cost, which has come about as a result of competition largely and improvements in technology. There's been a reduction in demand that's driven by reducing levels of crime principally, but also by different approaches to submission and changes to, if you like, the operating model, which the Met has done, but other forces have done in part as well. So there's a big complex package as to why that external spend figure has fallen. But the transition, if anything, it was the cause of the FSS problems rather than the result of the FSS problems, if that makes sense.
Indeed, yeah. Mr. Pugh, you talked about the scientists that you brought over from FSS. How many were there?
There was a TUPE transfer of 103 staff, 4 team leaders, 80 forensic staff and 19 support staff. The 4 team leaders actually took a package and left because there wasn't an equivalent role in the Metropolitan Police, but the remaining staff transferred to the Metropolitan Police on the 28th of November, when the whole package of transfer was signed off by the Police Authority, the Home Office and the FSS in a transfer agreement.
And this was a significant, you described the categories, a significant number of these are professional scientists.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed. Stephen Mossy.
Thank you. Last week we had heard some mixed opinions about the National Forensic Framework. Of course, the Next Generation Framework came in 1st of August last year. Could you describe the differences between the current framework and the previous framework?
Sure. I'll start. I'm sure others will help me. Well, it is based on a similar concept. It's a new OJU notice that's prompted it. So the OJU notice was completed August 2012. It's a four-year process. In completing that, it has allowed a number of additional organisations to enter and be part of the agreement. Probably then the differences are in what we refer to as the pipeline. So the way in which the different regional contracts are let. Because I think one of the criticisms before is we ended up with large parts of the country being let at the same time, which created, I think, excessive disruption. So what the pipeline has tried to do is to spread those contract renewals or contract reassignments over a 4-year period, so that we get a smoother changeover. But I think those are probably the principal issues, unless colleagues want to add other areas.
They are certainly the principal issues, so they are as a result of it. From our point of view, the words commoditised and transactional have been used already by others during the course of this morning. I think they are more along those lines than they were previously. And there are various different pricing points compared to what the old specifications had, where forces can enter the pricing point dependent on the work that they do in-house. So they're the principal differences in the way that it is at the moment.
I would add to that. I mean, we used the framework to put in place contracts for DNA analytical services, and I certainly see this. The procurement is a means to an end. We want that analysis to support crime investigation in London. So we work very closely with our providers to ensure that there is, if you like, a joined-up approach in terms of the provision of the results of that analytical data, and to deal with issues that arose. And as I've set out in my submission, in two areas, there certainly were issues in toxicology and gunshot residue analysis. And by working with our providers in terms of how we look at demand and prioritise and how they build additional capacity, we have come through those issues. But those were areas that there was some limited provision for a while. But certainly I see us as, this is a very close working with the commercial sector to get the right services for crime investigation.
One of the issues that was brought up last week was the framework makes it very difficult for new providers to come into the marketplace. Have you heard that complaint, and do you think it's a valid complaint?
I mean, we have had new providers come in as a result of this framework. I think you could take that question as a very, very general piece across the whole of the public sector, across every single aspect of what we deal with. And it is the problem that we have these monumentally bureaucratic and complex procurement processes. And, I look at some of the SMEs in Birmingham that would probably want to do more public business if they could, but struggle with the complexity of procurement. So I think you have a very general point there, but I think specifically on this, we have got some smaller providers who, if you like, are niche within their particular areas, and we've certainly got some new providers, and we have done quite a lot of work to try to help people get it onto the frameworks. It's in our interest that they do.
When you say new providers, these are providers that have come along at the beginning of the framework. Is it possible for companies to come along now and get onto the framework now it's been established, or do they have to wait for the next cycle?
They have to, yes, they have to wait for the next cycle, because there's a qualification process to become part of the framework. But the next cycle is 2016. The preparation for it will in effect begin 2 years earlier. So it is a sort of moving piece, really.
Okay. But I would have thought that the forensics market is probably changing very quickly. Technology is changing, science is changing. What happens if someone comes along with a new technique, and you guys as police might want to use this technique? Do you have to wait for the next cycle to be able to bring it on?
No. I mean, the contracts are not... they allow us, for example, to use... specialist analysis. I mean, for example, in a very high-profile case, we used a company in Pennsylvania that does mitochondrial profiling of hair. They're the only organisation in the world who undertake that work, and we go to them to get that analysis done. So we can step outside of certainly our contracts or the framework where we have that requirement in particular cases. And I'd also add that I've seen a number of organisations, certainly I think the framework has stimulated interest, so I get quite a number of organisations approaching me, really asking, well, what is this all about? What are the requirements? And I met quite a large number now who have shown an interest in actually joining the framework, and I'm very happy to talk to them and explain how the Metropolitan Police sees the framework and its use of it.
Okay. There's no bar to anybody joining the framework, so they need to meet the required regulatory standards, etc., and any other procurement process that you would go through. And the framework itself is managed by a central team where there's a succession of mini tenders takes place over the period that Mr. Sims has already explained. So although 2016 is the start of the next framework, during that time a number of forces will be tendering for services. So there's no reason why anybody couldn't come onto the framework during that time, in between each of the tenders. But to suggest that we could enter into a contract with a supplier, and then another supplier come on and we preferred so ditch that contract, it would be very difficult to do. And the contracts have to be of sufficient length to allow the suppliers who are on the framework to get a return on their investment.
Okay. A slightly different issue with the framework. We heard, I think it was the last question of the previous panel, there's a description that in the old days the police would have gone with a jacket and said, we've got this jacket with a blood stain on it, what can you do? Whereas now the approach tends to be, here's a bit of material with a blood stain on it, can you do this test on it? We've heard from the providers last week that they would prefer a more partnership approach. Have you got any comments on that?
Well, I'm going to ask Gary perhaps to address the jacket, which has now become central to the debate. But I think there's a bigger issue now that we coexist with these main providers at all sorts of levels. We are at the moment talking at the very kind of operational commercial level. We could have a discussion, for example, around research and development, where I think there's really good partnerships going, where if you like, we are providing test environments for organisations to bring in new technology. We're helping to shape the demand for that technology by setting out what we think future requirement would look like. And that, I think, is a really important part of partnership, because that's helping the future of both organisations to move forward. Specifically then in this sort of narrower operational commercial field, I'd perhaps ask Gary to describe.
Yeah, I think the jacket needs to be seen in the context of how criminal investigations are undertaken. And as I referred to in my evidence in 2011, I mean, we have seen this major shift in the way forensic science is used, with the databases developing now, fingerprints and DNA. Our ability to rapidly identify a suspect in a case has just moved on immeasurably since, if you like, the old days of when the van would drive up the lab full of lots of exhibits. So certainly in the Metropolitan Police, our focus and our model is based on a very quick response. That starts with a crime scene manager who are 24/7. They will be at a major incident in London within minutes, if not hours, and they will take control of that. The forensic science input to that then in the Metropolitan Police is through forensic scientists who are trained, and this is where we perhaps differ from other forces or even providers. They are trained in the location recovery of not just DNA or blood and body fluids, but also in finger marks and in footwear marks. So they take, if you like, an holistic approach to that. But that examination then is very focused and very quick to identify that critical item or that critical blood stain on the jacket that we can identify an offender from using, if you like, modern DNA techniques. And we'll show you a case when you visit tomorrow where we effectively solved a murder in 48 hours using that approach. And that's a very big change. And I use the expression real-time forensics in my previous submission and again in this one. I think one of the things that will shape this market is, and it's not just in DNA, but in fingerprints as well, and drugs analysis, is this move towards this real-time analysis of forensic material, where, as I've said before, the laboratories and the fingerprint bureaus could become redundant. This effectively takes the technology right to the crime scene and allows you to generate results very, very quickly.
On the basis that if you can identify a suspect really quickly, then that opens up a whole avenue of different investigative processes, from interview, from finding stolen property to phone work. And I think this is a sort of quite an important change. It shouldn't be seen necessarily as a threat, but an opportunity.
Can I add that, sorry, I think also the interpretation of that crime scene and establishing the sequence of events or validating the account of a suspect or witnesses is a critical part of the thinking, if you like, and goes into that before you get to testing the jacket. And that's what we're focused on.
Can I just ask you, Mr. Moore, in terms of your evidence, was what you described as a different way of procuring to the rest of the country, or is this just a different description?
No, many of the things that have been said by Gary and Mr. Sims are exactly what we're talking about. And the first thing I'd like to say really is, I'm sure I didn't mean it in this way, sir, but the relationships are far from cosy. the very robust, managed and challenging relationships that we have with our forensic providers. But unlike the Metropolitan Police, who have the luxury of staff and the facilities to deliver various analysis and scientific work, within the North East we don't have that ability. So our partnership is looking at the end-to-end process of criminal justice system for forensic recovery and forensic analysis. And we are experts in forensic recovery. We know what we're doing, and we're in managing crime scenes. The scientists are experts at analysing and interpreting the results of that forensic recovery. So the partnership for me is working together on the end-to-end process to get the best for the criminal justice system.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Chairman. As I'm sure you're aware, there's been a great deal of discussion around what the size of the forensic market is. When the decision was taken to close the FSS, the market was around, I now have the figure, 170 million in 2009, with a projection that it would drop to about 110 million by 2015. When it's already dropped below that, probably 100 million shrinkage over the 3 years. Could you explain or expand on why you think that shrinkage has happened and where that work has gone?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to slightly repeat the sort of factors again, and I can go into more detail. But firstly, crime has fallen really sharply. I can say for West Midlands, we will end the year at least another 10% down, and a lot of the crime is around things like burglary, where a lot of the bulk forensic science was delivered. So there's some positives to start with, I think. Then I think there is, if you like, the change of method issue, which again we've heard a little bit about the Met, but others are doing part of. So in effect, in a very sort of dynamic territory, the borderline between where we put something as external delivery has shifted because of the changes in technology, the changes in investigative philosophy, has all made it so that more of that work is done earlier within a policing context. I think the other issue, that there's been a lot of work within the criminal justice system, a piece that started under the name of staged reporting, which again is a very positive value for money initiative, and says in philosophical terms, let's not analyse something that is going to end as uncontested material within a case. Let's stage the analytical process, let's stage the expenditure on forensic science and other parts of policing, so that it's not wasted on a case that may end in a guilty plea or may end where the contested part of the evidence isn't in fact identity or presence at the scene, but something entirely different. So all of those factors, and probably others too, are impacting on the size of the market. Let's be honest, in a climate where forces are under extraordinary financial pressure and having to make a series of difficult decisions about what to prioritise.
So expanding on what Mr. Sims has said already, there's no doubt about it that initiatives such as streamlined forensic reporting and the austerity measures have caused us to think more closely about what we submit. There is another factor. The forensic science has become cheaper. It's become more automated. The jug of blood that we used to have to send at one time to get a DNA profile from is not there anymore. We can send much less. It's done in a much more technological way, and it doesn't need the people there to do it. But we've become much more intelligent customers as well. We know what we're likely to get a result from, and so we play our part in contribution to the savings that forces have got to make. And so we will send things that we know we will likely to get a result from. And we're different from scientists. If you ask a scientist if something is possible, they'll say yes. In the old days, we would send it to them and say, will you try and do it for us? The next question we now ask is it probable? And if it's not probable, then we'll not send it. And so we've become much more intelligent in what we submit and how we manage our services. And that inevitably, as I say, along with the cost of science itself going down, has led to the fall in the market.
And then I would offer one more explanation, which I think you've probably explored at previous hearing, but the DNA Expansion Fund and the period that surrounded it, and a number of us were involved in that process, did deliberately push forensic spend up, because part of the philosophy of that process was to increase the size of the database. And all of that expenditure increasing the database was sort of pushed into a fairly short period of time and led to a big jump in expenditure. So the fall is against a peak rather than probably simply against a longer term average.
Okay. So there's a whole bundle of different and complex reasons, but one of those is that you have brought some of that work in-house and are doing it more inside the police service. As both a customer of forensic science and now obviously a supplier to yourselves, do you and with a diminishing market, do you think that your position is, or the service as a whole, means that you have too much control over the market, that you are able to wield too much power that will drive prices down, that might make the commercial market unsustainable?
Again, I'm sure we've all got perspectives on this, but I think we are very, very mindful about the market that we operate in. I'm very respectful of the organisations that choose to be part of that market, and this, I think, is where the bigger partnership issue sits. We are very, very interested in making sure, as far as we are able to, that they have a proper commercial future, and that their intentions are to remain in the market because there is a dependence on them. I think it's really important to distinguish between the role of individual forces, the role of ACPO, and the role of Home Office in that. When individual forces are charged to try and get value for money, they're charged to operate in a way that's safe and responsible. ACPO, through myself and Chris Eyre, who is Chief Constable who leads FIM in this area, does have the responsibility, I think, to look beyond that at the market. But it is Home Office, through their committee that I'm a part of, that ultimately are the people who look at the long-term risk associated with market. And in a sense, ACPO supports and plays into that group.
And the committee you're talking about is the Forensic Science Policy Group, yes?
It is, yes.
And I mean, is that making progress at looking at those issues?
I think it's early days for it, because in effect it really only began its new life. It existed some time ago, it stopped for a period, was dominated by the transition issue, has restarted. I think it's early days. I would say, as a member of that group, I think it needs to be more proactive in the way it considers risk and reacts to what it sees.
And one final question, if I may, Chairman. We've recently had elections for police and crime commissioners. Have they had any impact on this area yet? Is it something that's on any of their agendas to look at forensic science?
Well, of course, the Met's in a different position with a different governance arrangement. I've seen no impact yet. I mean, ultimately, the PCC will take from the old police authority the responsibility of owning the contractual relationship. The PCC will absolutely have a commitment to value for money, as indeed we do. But I briefly heard some of the earlier discussion, and the thought of the PCC being involved, if you like, in shaping the transaction feels utterly not where they would want to be or should be. So I think overall probably the answer is certainly not at the moment, and I don't anticipate it being a major issue.
Yes. So just add, I think, as Chris says, we clear a different situation in London, and having gone through the governance that was then the police authority, but it's replicated now in the deputy mayor. It was very clear the scrutiny of the business case and what we did was very detailed, and also it was on the basis there were no unfunded liabilities. So there is a governance that comes into play here that scrutinises what we do and how we do it, and certainly how we spend public money. And I'd add to that in terms of your market point. Sorry to go back, but There's two things. I think when we looked at this previously, I think 60% of our spend in the Met was linked to DNA profiling. So DNA profiling is a very dominant position in this spend. So if the unit cost goes down, then there is a contraction of the market. What I would say now is, and certainly from my position holding the budget for all forensic services in the Met, we are under pressure to reduce costs, and my budget will reduce. It's reduced this year and it will reduce again next year. And so I'm expected to make efficiency savings, and to give you a flavour of that, I've just approved 86 voluntary exits for forensic staff in the Metropolitan Police. So I think it's a broader picture now, certainly in the austerity that we are feeling in the police service.
Can I just... Sorry, go on. I just want to make a couple of comments, really. The first thing is that not everybody is insourcing. It's not wholesale insourcing going on within the police service. The North East region, for instance, has no plans to insource anything. And we're 20% of the police service for the United Kingdom, so it's not happening. Where insourcing is taking place is driven by, again, technology and the advances in science, where the equipment and the staff needed are much less than what they used to be. And if I could give an example on that, if you take a photograph, if you took a photograph 10 years ago, you had to take a photograph, you had to send the film off to develop, you had to wait for it to come back, and you were reliant on them to decide. You don't have to do that now. Imaging you can do on your own computer, on your own desktop, in your own time. I'm sure that you know nobody would expect us as a police service to just carry on doing what we used to do. This new technology is available to us. It's much cheaper. It's a way of contributing to the savings that we got to make. What we've got to be clear of, sorry, if we just finish with this, sir, is that we have to make sure there is a clear corridor between the evidence that we analyse and produce and the investigation. And that is a very clear picture for me, that sterile corridor has to be there. My fear is that the perception, because the police forces that do it, there will not be that clear corridor within the overall criminal justice system, whether it's there or not. We prefer, in the North East, not to take that risk. Others have chosen that they should take that risk. They're in a different situation than us.
Right. Your mention of the technologies leads me to my final question before I move on to other colleagues. Mr. Sims, in the beginning of your response, you talked about the stats relating to the fall of crime.
Yes.
And then we talked about the expenditure on forensics.
Yes.
Can I just go on to technology-related issues? Does your falling crime include computer crimes like ID theft?
No, I mean...
is ID theft in that list of...
ID theft, but if I broaden that a little bit to what we call e-crime, which is bigger than ID theft and includes...
No, I want to specifically... Can I be clear? Is identity theft included in your crime stats?
Well, I'd have to be clear what the criminal offence associated with identity theft.
The criminal offence is that my credit rating is then wrecked. I am personally damaged.
Yes, I understand the harm. I'm sorry, I'm looking at it...
So the offence is against me. I mean, the reason I ask this is that some forces do respond, and colleagues have said this, that ID theft is not being treated as a serious crime because there's no loser. Well, there is losers. Your credit ratings are wrecked, and therefore there is a loser.
I'd sort of my data, if you like, I can say for West Midlands Police that crime relating to IT, which would include that situation, has gone up, or the reporting of it has gone up about 5-fold in 3 years.
Yeah.
So as a constituent part of a shrinking overall crime level, IT-based crime has risen.
Yes, and presumably, therefore, and I've seen it in my own force, Cheshire, who are doing some fantastic work on forensic computing.
Yes.
The expenditure on forensic computing has gone up.
Yes. It makes a big, again, proportionally, is becoming a bigger and bigger share of expenditure.
When we're talking about expenditure on forensics,
yes,
are we talking about forensics including forensic computing, or are we excluding it?
Well, we're talking about all of that part of the expenditure which is external. And computer forensics is difficult because some of it is done by us, some of it is passed to external providers,
and
each
other
force
government agencies included as well.
And each force would have a slightly different mix of that market.
Yeah.
But I can only say, my experience, it's an increasing share of what we spend.
Just to add to that, and I think it's relevant to the size of the market debate. Digital forensics is a different operating model again, I think, because rather than the traditional laboratory model, you collect material, you send it to the laboratory, have it examined and analysed. What we're finding is that actually what we need to do is to enable frontline officers to be able to download the data from a mobile phone or an iPad and to do that very quickly. And there are devices that will do that, and we currently have, like other forces, we have put some of that technology out there on the ground with support staff to ensure it's used properly and effectively. So it's a different model, but it is a growing area, and again, something we're going to show you tomorrow in terms of how that growth. But if you like, if the traditional DNA forensics is being driven down by reduced crime and reduced unit costs, it's the digital area that is the growth area.
Yeah. And the Met as well, when they're talking about expenditure on forensics, include...
It's within my budget, as is fingerprints and scene examination and so on, yes.
Okay, thanks. David.
Thanks, Chair. How much is currently being spent by the police forces on in-house forensics at this moment in time?
Sorry, I missed the start.
How much is currently being spent by police forces on in-house forensics?
I haven't got that figure for you for reasons that we described before. That is a very complicated figure. Do you include guarding a scene in that? Do you include the full cost of scene management? You'd have to just help shape what your question...
It would be a broad across the board figure.
Well, we have before talked about a figure of around 170, 180 million. 2%.
Yeah. Sorry,
there
has been some collection, if you like, of the cost by the HMI. There's some value for money data, and that comes out. Again, I think there are issues, because your point about digital, some forces count that within forensics and some don't. So I think there may be, but in broad terms, as I understand, about 2% of the police expenditure is on forensic, if you like, capability, whether it's insourced or outsourced.
Mr. Pugh, also, by taking over the FSS Lambeth Lab, how much more is the Met Police spending internally on forensic science, would you say?
So my budget is reduced, so we've made a saving through doing that. So we're not overall spending more if you look at both the in-source and outsourced.
You presumably didn't have the capital cost of the building. That was...
Well, the building was leased to the FSS, so the building was taken back. So there wasn't a capital expenditure. There was expenditure of running costs on the 100 or so staff and so on. So we've incurred those costs, but of course we're not buying in services, so the net effect was a saving.
So, from answering from our point of view, I mean, from the northeast, overall is very difficult. But from my own force, which is South Yorkshire, our in-house spend on forensics is 3.5 million, 3.5 million pounds. But that takes into account all the remit of the management, the crime scene investigators, the fingerprint laboratory, the consumables, and everything else that we have to do with that. Our outsourced budget for forensics is about £2.7 million, but that's solely on outsourced forensics. That's what within within South Yorkshire, that is the case. The outsourced budget for the North East is currently about £12 million, and it fell from £21 million 10 years ago.
Yes. And Mrs. Pugh, will all police laboratories achieve the ISO 1725 accreditation this year for DNA by 2050 for fingerprint work?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Will all police laboratories, in your opinion, achieve ISO 17025 accreditation this year for DNA and by 2015 for fingerprint work?
I'm sorry, I don't know about the other forces. We certainly have. We have accreditation for both the chemical recovery of fingerprints, which is the requirement, the EU requirement, and we have full 17025 accreditation for all our capabilities at Lambeth. I know that under Chris's leadership there's a a project to bring all forces in terms of their fingerprint capability, their in-house capability, up to 17025. But
yes, we have a programme of work within ACPO where we're working with the regulator, in effect, in an agreement with the regulator, because one of the limiters on time is the ability of UCAS to push through the accreditation process across the whole organisation. So we've had to sort of prioritise that programme. The early priorities were around the fingerprint recovery process and those parts of the policing world that were closest to laboratory work. And so we're pushing those forward, and they are finished, I believe, early 2014, and then the rest of the programme follows behind. So we are moving as quickly as we can towards a position where the whole of the police service is reaching that accreditation. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to ask you about archives again, and perhaps excluding the Met, because I understand, you have your own arrangements. But, gentlemen, could you tell me what the location and size of archives are for individual police forces? How is this arranged?
Do you want to?
Or perhaps the Met as well.
The Met has got a pretty clear picture, I think, and that's a historic one.
Just
in relation to the change.
Let me begin perhaps by just talking a little bit about the archive, because the archive issue was really a byproduct of the transition from the FSS, because the FSS held a lot of police material from the period where it had operated. And as we foresaw the end of the FSS, therefore a parallel project was created to manage how that archive was going to be dealt with. That project is still in operation. It is delivering a service to the forces that have material with the FSS that is now at a point where it's reliable, it's serving the criminal justice ends that it requires to serve. There is still, I think it's fair to say, a debate about how the future of that project should move. And one or two forces, I think, would seek to have their part of the archive returned. Gary probably is leading the biggest force in this area, will probably see it in that perspective. Others would find that position very difficult. There was a debate as to whether this was a service that was retained within the public sector or outsourced, and I think probably on balance that's moving back to a position where it's retained. But we're still at a position where those options are being debated and considered.
So from my point of view, I'm not aware of any forces in the North East who have a forensic archive. We retain case files, but the forensic evidence remains with our suppliers, and that was previously with the Forensic Science Service, and it is now with our current supplier. So they hold it on our behalf, although it remains our property and our evidence. You made a comment earlier that said, who will pay for it? And I found that quite interesting. So I'll tell you who will pay for it. The police will pay for it, because the suppliers are not going to do it out of the goodness of their heart, and the government's not going to give it to anyone else.
I think you heard the previous evidence session on that. There is a logic that says if the external providers were able to lodge such files with a central archive,
yes,
that the cost, both revenue and capital costs of maintaining that archive, would be lower than them having to establish an archive themselves.
Absolutely, and that's what we would prefer. And
can we be clear? You would prefer essentially the Forensic Archive Limited to handle ongoing cases as well as the historic archive?
Yes, we would know where everything was. That's my position, and our forces.
And I'll say on behalf of ACPO that this is a group. David Shaw, Chief Constable of West Mercia, represents me on that group, and that is still moving forward with a series of options. Yeah. Kevin has outlined one. There are others that are being considered.
Mr. Pugh, you wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the Home Office were going to fund that part of our archive, then clearly it'd be churlish for me not to take up their offer. I think that I think I'll just make 2 points actually relevant to this. One is that bear in mind in terms of the freezer issue and all that storage that of course under the Protection of Freedoms Act we will destroy somewhere in the region of 6 million DNA samples. So there'll be a much reduced requirement, and under the provisions of that Act, of course, we can only retain DNA samples for 6 months. So there won't be these great freezer storage that we've currently got now, and that will go under that provision. So I think you just need to bear that in mind. I think when you see lots of freezers, they won't be there in a year's time.
It's the nature of archives that they're handed to. And Mr. Morton, you just said that the archives are kept by the commercial organisations which serve you. Is that the case for every police force?
Yeah.
That's Mr. Sims.
Yeah. Pretty much. It's still owned by the force. The force never loses ownership of the material it submits, but it's hosted, if you like, by the people that analyse it.
I'm not going to ask you how much it costs, but presumably because that's a specific service that could be costed.
Well, it's built into the cost of the original submission.
Yeah. I think one of the things we found a bit surreal about the visit to Birmingham was that it isn't just DNA samples in the fridge next door to where we were having sandwiches, but the scale is pretty significant. I think 45 million file items. How big is your archive?
We certainly have millions of fingerprint records by definition, because we used to hold the National Fingerprint Database. I think, as has been mentioned, there is a weeding policy around that, for crime generally. So some crimes files are destroyed in 7 or 10 years, and more serious crimes 30 years, and some are 100 years. So there is an established process in the case files. I'd make the point as well, I think, that after the case has progressed through the criminal justice system, the opportunity for appeal is gone, then the whole thing does become fairly dormant. So a lot of our case files are stored in a salt mine somewhere where, we access them rarely. And actually, it's only cold case review where I think sometimes, if you like, the case file becomes...
It's probably our salt mine in Cheshire.
Oh, right. That's very kind of you. So I think, once you've got through that part of the case being live, there are occasional, obviously, challenges to the CCRC, but it's a very limited intervention, so you can safely put it away somewhere for the period it needs to be stored under the CPIA.
I think you've answered the question as to where you think they should be held, and you think it would be useful to have them all held centrally.
This is a personal view, and Mr. Shaw is leading a working group to look at this at this moment in time. But from my point of view, it's impractical for us as forces. We don't have the estate, we don't have the conditions in which to house it. And how do other people, when we're looking at cross-border crime, access our files and know where they are, where a central repository would give us that. What it needs to be is much more better indexed than what it is at this moment in time. And I think the point that Gary makes is that, as the Protection of Freedom Act takes effect, a lot of these samples that we're now using will not be there to use anyway. They'll be destroyed, so that will not be there. And over the last 5, 6, 7 years probably, most police forces have gone through a programme of looking at cold cases, certainly for serious sexual offences and homicides, where they may have missed forensic evidence previously. And we've all gone through that and at different levels and in different stages, and most have got through it. So what's left in the archive that's worth us looking at, I'm not quite sure.
I just wanted to ask, perhaps Mr. Sims, what influence do you think ACPO, or gentlemen in general, do you have over the future of Forensic Archives Limited?
On the archives?
Are your voices being heard?
Oh yes, David Shaw is in effect sort of leading that process. The project management for it comes from within Home Office. So yeah, absolutely.
If it were finally determined that Birmingham was one centre and the Met were another, which is not an irrational outcome, One thing, of course, you know better than we do, that criminals don't respect force boundaries. There needs to be an archive system that anyone that is doing a cold case review can look at both information in Birmingham and in the Met, for example. Yeah. Is there work going on in the Met to ensure that the indexing system that you use parallels, replicates the indexing system that's been adopted by Birmingham?
It doesn't replicate it. We have set up, as I said at my submission, we have a cold case team, so we have people who are actually still looking at some historic cases and looking for opportunities. I think that the guiding principle for me here is that we must extract the maximum information from the case, not just to progress it through the criminal justice system, but have an eye to linking it with other cases. So that's the forensic intelligence in that. And therefore we need to do that at the outset. It's very time consuming to go back and try and extract that. But certainly we have occasions where police forces have come to us where they believe offences in the Met were committed by a serial offender, and we will make that information freely available to them, as we would any details of a criminal investigation they thought was linked perhaps to an offender in their force.
But ultimately, if there was a proper search facility of the indexing system...
I certainly think one of the issues, and I think it's more a consequence of this being about the FSS rather than the archive, but one of the things we found difficult is that because it's all paper records in Birmingham, the FSS systems, and particularly the laboratory management systems which held that index, are not accessible, and that's meant it's been more time consuming to get to the files.
Well, that's the point I made. They are going through the indexing process. Yeah. They've adopted a methodology which is it's not absolute bleeding edge, but it's a pretty high technology that is designed to have longevity. It is important that both their system is accessible to the Met and the Met system is accessible to other police officers elsewhere in the country.
Yes,
I think it's important to understand the process of the cold case reviews and the way that it's done. I mean, I'm not up to date as to where the archive is at the moment, to be honest, but I know there used to be 2 or 3 people from the FSS who actually understood the indexing system, and, you know, if anything happens to them, God forbid, I don't know where we're going to be.
We heard that, and that's why they're going through this big revision.
That is a real difficulty. But the process for actually investigating cold cases is generally stems from an in-force review. We know with in-forces what rapes we've got, what historic rapes, what historic homicides we've got that remain undetected, particularly if they're in a series or whatever. The investigation is promulgated by us identifying that and then actually going to the archive to see what material is in the archive related to that offence. Okay, so it's not looking at the archive and it shows us what is there that we might be able to look at. It is a reverse system.
And just before we close, Mr. Truding has an unrelated question.
A couple of short questions. Going back to something Mr. Pugh said earlier on about the number of staff you've taken on from Forensic Science Service. What happened to the 4 team leaders, please?
They took effectively redundancy prior to joining the Metropolitan Police. They were identified within the TUPE transfer, but they took redundancy.
So was that early redundancy? Was it? Would they have stayed on in the service if they could have done for another 10 years, for example? Was that a serious loss or not?
No, I mean, I think from memory, they were team leaders and managers. I think some of them actually weren't forensic scientists. They were, if you like, they come from the private sector.
Do you think the computer links between forces are adequate for the purposes of forensic science?
I think, to start with, I think the fact we have a national fingerprint and a national DNA database, so unsolved crimes where we obtain DNA or fingerprints are stored nationally and searched nationally is extremely important. We also, of course, have a national ballistic intelligence system. Again, you'll see this tomorrow. But we actually are able, through 3 centres in the UK, to link guns and the use of firearms. So I think there are systems in place to link forensic material. I think beyond that, there are if you like, central intelligence units that look at crime generally. Perhaps Chris can expand on that.
Yeah, the last point, I was almost a statement really, rather than a question. I must say, intuitively, I think fragmentation of the National Archive would be a mistake, because down the road, who knows where the little bits will end up. And I don't really want to comment on that.
No, I think we probably all agree with you.
Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Mr. Sims, we will, given your offer to help us with our inquiries, I always wanted to say that. We will follow up with a detailed letter, which I'd be grateful if you'd seek the cooperation of your ACPO colleagues over, because there is, as I indicated to you, quite a lot of confusion about expenditure and what, partly because of the reasons you've explained, what's happening to money, whether the closure of the FSS was a smart idea, whether there have been consequential benefits, whether there have been consequential disadvantages like the archive and so on. And what we're trying to do is to drill down and get to the bottom of that, but also to have a better understanding of what's happening in terms of your needs as professional police officers, in terms of the resources that you will need for the future, because this isn't just about the FSS and what happened last year. It's about resourcing policing in the future. So thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you.